You're listening to Dark Matter Radio. This is Solaris BlueRaven with Hyperspace. My special guest is Grant Cameron. We're discussing all sorts of topics, mainly UFOs and consciousness. And Grant, where were we before we?
I was just talking about this idea that people are sort of influenced. Some of the major people that when you start looking back at especially sighting experiences. And you suddenly realize weird things. And I was mentioning this girl in Canada who has a sighting, daylight sighting. The object is sitting there very close. They're just sitting there watching the object. The object's just sitting there. They're watching the object. It's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. It's just sitting there, very clear, close enough that if you wave at it, they could see you waving at them, stuff like that. And then you go and you start looking at stuff in ufology, and you listen to Bud Hopkins' description of his UFO sighting in 1964. He gets involved in 75. He starts doing the abduction stuff. He really gets involved. He has this UFO sighting in 1964. And when you listen to it, you go like, wow, this is an abduction experience. I mean, he's sitting there. He's got two witnesses. They're in a car. They stop the car. This daytime sighting. This flying saucer sitting there, clear as day, daylight. It's sitting there. They're sitting there watching it. It's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. Just sitting there. They're watching it, sitting there, and they sit there for like 3, 4, 5 minutes, and they just sit there and watch this thing, and then it just flies off, which sounds so bizarre. It sounds like so many contactee first experiences where they're seeing this thing, and you start looking at that kind of stuff where you start wondering, are they influencing the people who are researching? And this comes back, it sort of plays with me, because when I first saw my sighting in 1975. And I've told the story. The first night was very dramatic. The thing flew in front of the car. We didn't think we'd see anything, and it was there. I just sort of fell off the edge of the earth. I was totally influenced, which happens in ufology. What you'll see is the people who will get into ufology, who are researchers, they can quit. And we used to have an expression years ago. Somebody would quit. They say, that's it, we've had with UFOs, and somebody would tell me, I'd say, don't worry, they'll be back. You cannot quit. They always come back. You can say, that's it. And you get dragged back in for whatever reason. You get back. And it happened to me. I quit for 10 years. And when I came back in after 10 years, I was more obsessed than I was the first go around. But you have this sort of thing where when I had my first sighting, I sort of fell off the edge of the earth. The second sighting I remember, and it was like the Bud Hopkins sighting. The thing was coming directly at us the second night. It was very low. It was very close. I don't know how close it was because at night you really can't tell in the dark. It was either very big or very close. It came right at us. It just sort of sat there. It hesitated. We all looked at it. The one guy beside him, he was unloading his camera. He was shooting pictures as fast as he could shoot pictures. And then the thing just slowly flew off into the north. And I remember watching it as it just slowly flew off, and I thought, that's strange. Like, what are they doing? Because we'd heard the stories. There's so many news reports about this thing. That's why we went out there. And when I saw it, then I'm thinking, well, what are they doing? I mean, it's like they're just flying around burning gas. They're not doing anything. They're just there. And then for years later, the more and more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me, why was I so heavily affected by this? Maybe this was part of a trigger, to trigger me, and that's why they appeared. And this is a sort of a phenomena or a theory that's being proposed more and more in the UFO community, is that the people are being triggered. So you hear this Bud Hopkins sighting. When you hear him describe it, you go, that's a trigger. That's a trigger sighting. That's to either motivate him to do something. And you get these other stories. Jan Hartson, who, I don't know if you know his story, Jan Hartson, who's the international director for MUFON, tells how he got involved. It's the same sort of thing. He tells the story. Your young kids, he's 9, he's 10, his brother's 9. They're into flying saucers. They're all interested because his father would leave the UFO magazines from True magazine or whatever, these adult father magazines, and he'd read the UFO stuff and stuff like that. And he said he's at the store the one day, and his mother buys him a magazine, and in the magazine it has a UFO article, and the magazine says that the UFOs appear around nuclear plants, around where they're producing nuclear weapons, and it appears around people who are doing anti-gravity research. Well, him and his brother had decided that they were going to build a flying saucer, and they had this idea about 4 anti-gravity engines or whatever, and they were going to put it in there. And then they thought, when they read this article, they said, oh, that's neat. If they appear around people who are doing anti-gravity research, maybe they'll appear to us. Exactly a month later, this is 1965 or whatever, and Jan Hartson's 10 years old. He says, suddenly his brother waking him up. His brother says, get up, get up. There's somebody trying to get into my room. There's somebody at the window. They're trying to get in my room. And his brother was always playing around. He said, leave me alone. He said, no, I'm serious. Somebody's trying to get in my room. So Jan gets up, and his younger brother leads him there. And they look in the room, and there's nothing at the window. So they start going down to look at what's in the backyard. They go down, and Jan is facing the wrong way, and his brother is going backwards down. And he said, there, at the window, there. And by the time Jan looked, it was gone. And he still figured, well, maybe his brother's playing around. They go out to the back door, and they go out, and this is 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning. They walk out the back door, and there's a flying saucer sitting about 30 feet away. And 30 feet is pretty close. Think about it. 30 feet away, there's this object sitting there, and it's just sitting there, just hovering. There's no beings. There's nothing, just sitting there. And so they were sitting there looking at this, and Jan was just floored, and they're all excited. They're just watching this thing, and it was not moving, not doing it, just sitting there. And Jan decides, I want to take a picture of this. So he goes to get back in the house. The door is locked, so he's banging on the door. He's banging as hard as he can. He's trying to wake up his third brother to come to the door, let him in so he can get his camera. Eventually, after about 10 minutes, he gets in the house. He goes to get the camera. He comes back out, and the object is gone. His brother's on top of the swing set. His brother's looking in the west or wherever the direction this thing had gone. And Jan said, where did it go? And his brother said, it just moved up, it floated away, and it took off. So Jan said, when he discussed it at school, one of his friends had said to him, oh, well, my father is in the aerospace industry. They're working on that kind of stuff. That was probably my father testing. And Jan says to him, and this is the key thing, Jan says, why would they be testing flying saucers in my backyard on Saturday morning? And that's the whole thing. Why was this thing sitting in his backyard? It doesn't make any sense. If it's somebody testing something, or even the aliens doing something, why would they just sit there? And so Jan said, and he describes very clearly this consciousness element that I discussed, where he said he thinks it was a trigger, because he said his life was totally altered by this experience. He said his life was never the same. He said he decided he had to become an engineer. He was going to work on UFO propulsion. His whole life was motivated, and he ended up becoming International Director of MUFON because of this dramatic experience. And you find numerous stories of people. Jack Sarfati. Jack Sarfati is the zero-point energy guy. Him and Hal Puthoff are always having these arguments about who's closest to figuring out flying saucer propulsion, the zero-point energy. He's this brilliant physicist who publishes a number of books talking about his UFO experiences. He tells this story when he's 12 years old. He tells this story. He's a Jewish kid living in the Bronx, and he says the phone rings. He picks up the phone, and he's reading a book on switching systems. He's still already into sort of mechanical stuff and mechanics and stuff like that. And he says, there's this voice, a metallic voice, which was heard by the Canadian government. The Canadian government guy reported the metallic voices. Uri Geller described the metallic voices. They were at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, described these metallic voices that were giving them messages. So he hears this metallic voice, and it's saying, is this Jack? And he said, yeah, this is Jack. And he said, this is a computer on a flying saucer. And Jack went, yeah, okay, and he figured, that's one of my friends playing a joke on me or whatever. So he listens, and this metallic voice is going on. And the metallic voice says, we have decided we have 400 brilliant young minds that we want to transfer the knowledge and the technology to. You have to agree to this. You have to volunteer for this. We can't just make you do it. If you volunteer, you will be one of the 400 people that we will pick to download this information, and 20 years from now, you will begin to meet the other people. So he says, yeah, okay. And he said he felt this shock go from the bottom of his spine all the way up to the back of his neck, goes up his spine as he said yes. And he said, they said, okay, get out on the fire escape. In 10 minutes, we'll pick you up on the flying saucer. So he goes, oh, yeah, whatever. He goes and gets his buddies. He's got his own gang. He goes, gets his buddies, and he says, I just got a call from Flying Saucer. He said, come on, and they go and they stand on the deck, and nothing happens. So he drops it, except that 20 years later, exactly as they predicted, 20 years later, Uri Geller appears in San Francisco, where he lives. Uri Geller appears. There's all these synchronicities about Uri Geller. He decides he's going to follow Uri Geller. He's about to go to England to teach at London University physics. And he decides that he's going to follow up on this Uri Geller thing, so he phones SRI. SRI in 1972 had begun the remote viewing, all the psychic phenomena stuff. Kit Green from the CIA was running it, and this was the highlight of parapsychology research in the United States. Starts in 1972, exactly 20 years later. He phones and he gets a hold of the guy, Brendan O'Rourke. Brendan O'Rourke, I think was his name. And he phones up, he says, I'm interested in this Uri Geller. And they said, oh, Dr. Sarfati, we've been expecting your call. And he said, like, what's the chances of that? And then he meets these guys, and he talks about how these guys, he thinks they're the 400 people. There's Hal Puthoff at the Austin Advanced Research Institute, Russell Targ, Uri Geller, all these great remote viewers, all these experiments, the U.S. government's doing all this mind stuff there. And this is the connection that he makes. And later on, when Uri Geller puts out his book, his mother reads it, and she says, this is the same thing. I know this metallic voice, because what happened was she got on the phone rang, and the metallic voice is on there. He was talking to this metallic voice again, and she got on the phone, and she said, well, what are you doing? Who are you? And they said, please, could you put Jack back on the phone? And she said, don't ever phone my son again. And she hung up the phone. And so her recollection, Jack Sarfati only remembers the one call. Her mother said the calls went on for 3 weeks. He was sitting there talking on this phone to whoever this was for like 3 weeks at 12 years old. So you get this bizarre story where you get people who are sort of motivated. And Colin Andrews tells two very bizarre stories. And you got to remember, this is a main guy who did a lot of the main stuff that's in ufology. A major piece of the UFO puzzle was the crop circles. And he was the main guy who did all this stuff, that gave the name crop circles as the biggest catalog of crop circles. He's still involved. He's the world expert on this. And he tells a story in 1977 where the crop circles appear, where he gets this message. He buys his first tape recorder, real tape recorder. He's a communications guy for the UK government, and he's got this tape recorder, and he's testing the tape recorder. At that time, and he turns the tape recorder on for the first time. He's in the living room. ITN, the TV network, is on. He said, as he turns the tape recorder on, suddenly the picture starts to break up, and there's this voice that he actually gets on this tape. And it's a 6-minute message. It's a message from the aliens, and they're given this whole message about you've got to stop the weapons, you've got to do all that stuff. He tapes the entire 6 minutes. And because he's a communication expert, he was on the inside. He said there was 4 major investigations done by the ITN network and by the British government to figure out where this signal had come from, because they were flooded by thousands of people phoning about this message because it was on everybody's TV. The towers, the 2 towers that this message had come from that were controlled were the same 2 towers that broadcast over the area of Britain where all the crop circles would later appear. So he tells this bizarre story about how he starts in 1977 with this bizarre tape recording message that he gets off the TV. The other one he tells is just, it's this idea where you're told to come forward and talk. He talks about in 2009, he finds out, he goes through, he does all the analysis, they're doing this scientific work on the crop circles or whatever, and he knows something's wrong. And in 1997, he gets regressed by Dr. Harder, and he finds out he's been abducted. 1957, he was abducted. He's got all the medical records. He had all these problems with his body. This rash breaks out, and he's got all the medical records, all documented, people detailing. He saw things under the bed. He was telling his parents, and his parents didn't believe him. He had all this sort of stuff. In 1997, he finally finds out that he has an abduction experience in 1957. Long before Betty and Barney Hill, but he doesn't remember till he gets this triggering in 1997 where he's turned on. So he has this experience, but he knows he can't come forward because he's the crop circle guy. He's the scientist. You can't come forward and say you've been abducted. He said he's in the shower in Connecticut in 2009. He said he's sitting in the shower, and he's just sort of meditating and letting the water flow down. And he said all of a sudden there's a voice in his head. And the voice says, you have to come forward. And he said, I knew exactly what they meant. I knew exactly what they wanted me to come forward. He said, I knew he was now to talk about the abduction. And he said to himself in his mind, he said, I can't do it. He said his stomach started to turn over. He said, if I do this, I'm a Looney Tune. They're going to write me off. I can't do this. And he said the voice in his head said, no, timing is everything. You have to do this. You have to come forward. And then he decided, yes, he suddenly agreed. He felt good about it. He figured, I'm going to do it. He gets all the medical records from when he was 5 years old in 1957, and he decides he's going to come forward. He's giving a talk at the X Conference, Steve Bassett's X Conference in 2009. The presentation that he was supposed to give was the fact that Nick Pope had come out and said that the UK government was not involved in crop circles. They had nothing to do with crop circles. And Colin Andrews had dealt with the cabinet, with Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, with all the high-ranking officials, and he was going to come forward and say, yes, here's the documentation. The UK government was involved, and Nick Pope is not telling the truth. So he's going to give this speech, but he realizes he's got to change the speech. He does not announce it to anybody what he's going to talk about. He's going to go and he's going to talk about being abducted and fit this into this whole story about how he was motivated, that he believed he'd been triggered to study the crop circles. Because he said in 1983, when he saw that first crop circle, he was driving down the highway. He said thousands of people drove that highway that day, and lots of people saw that crop circle with the cross, with the circles. He said, it was like my experience, like Bud Hopkins. It was this triggering experience. He said, my life, it was totally altered. Half a second, I saw those crop circles. My life changed forever as soon as that happened. So he's going to come forward. He's going to tell this speech. He gets to the X conference. He gets to the podium. He's about to give the speech, and there's a guy in the front row. He said, looks totally human. The guy looks at him. He said he's looking past him and into his mind, and the guy says to him, you know you have to talk about this, don't you? And Colin just shook his head, said yes. And he got up and he made the speech and he talked about it. And then when he made the speech, 2 years later, he made the same speech again. Then suddenly Stephen Greer comes forward and talks about his experience, the same sort of experience. And he starts to cry. Colin Andrews is crying. Greer was crying. And then Lynn Katai talked about her experience, how she got the message and how she was motivated, and this triggering type message. So you get these messages constantly. And let me give you a final example, which was one of the things that really got me going on this. This is, you take a look at the people who do the regressions. One of the people is Barbara Lamb, and I don't know if you've ever interviewed her. She's done, I don't know what the number is, probably 2,300 regressions, huge number of regressions. She did not start until 1988. She talks about how she got involved in UFOs. Like me, she had no recollection of ever being interested in UFOs, knowing anything about UFOs. She's a family therapist, starts in 1975 as a family therapist. She's a family therapist. She works for 13 years, and in 1988, she's taking a course on regressions, how to do regressions. She's in the advanced course. She's on the course. She's sitting in the classroom, and the instructor says, oh, by the way, while you're doing regressions, from time to time, you may run across this situation. Somebody's going to say to you, they were abducted by little gray aliens. And Barbara Lamb says to herself, she says, that's weird. I've never heard anything like that before. That's really unusual. That is really something. And at exactly the same time, she hears this booming voice in the back of her head says, listen carefully, Barbara. You're going to be doing this. And it was at that point where suddenly she starts getting flooded with people who have had alien experiences. And now she's one of the people who's done more regressions than anybody else. And it all started with this experience where she was told. So when I hear this thing, every time she says it, I hear this thing. It's like the aliens are saying, get ready, Barbara. We're about to send you some people. And so that's my impression of what they're doing. When a person has this, an abduction experience, what I say is it's an awakening experience. If you take it back, you'll find out they probably had this experience their entire life, right back to childhood. It's not a one-time experience. You don't just get abducted when you're 45 years old like Chris Bledsoe, and that's it. It usually, if it's a legitimate experience, it goes all the way back because they pick them as kids. So that's what I say is they're doing. It's whether you've got these people who are being told you are to come forward, you are to go out there and tell the message. The girl that runs the Experiencer conference in Maine, her name escapes me, but she has the big Experiencer conference in Maine in September. She tells a story about complaining to the aliens that she's going to class. She can faintly remember she's always in class. They're putting in her class to do this, but she doesn't remember anything. And she says to them, like, what's the point? This is a total waste of time. Why are you putting me in these classes? I don't remember anything. And they basically say, when it's time, you will remember. And if you look at David Jacobs' research, David Jacobs has this sort of end of the world scenario. They're up to no good. Whatever's going on here, these aliens, they're about to take over or whatever they're going to do. I fear for my kids. I'm an old man. I really don't care. But they're up to something. They're doing this. And he talks constantly about this fact that a lot of the people will talk about the fact that they have something to do, but they don't know what it is. And they've been told when the time is right, you will know what you're supposed to do. And that's where he has this alien invasion type thing, was at some point they're going to turn on these millions of people and they're going to take over. So this is common through all this abduction research, is this idea that people have stuff, that they're being trained to do stuff. And that's when it came to this consciousness thing. I sort of disagree with David Jacobs on this alien invasion thing, and this comes down to the consciousness thing, which I think maybe I've talked about on your show before.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that consciousness, the Canadian government knew in 1950, they were told by the American government that mental phenomena was involved with the flying saucer phenomena. Mm-hmm. 6 months later, in Canada, one of the people that was involved in the UFO phenomena, the UFO program, was at the first MK Ultra meeting in Montreal. That's when the MK Ultra stuff started. So the Canadians knew, the CIA knew, everybody knew that mental phenomena was involved. And I think it was because they had a live alien in Roswell, New Mexico. They realized the mental phenomena, this telepathy thing, they realized this was important. And that's why the CIA started doing all drug experiments. That's why they started all this stuff, was they realized that if you could figure out how the mind works, the consciousness, if you could open up the consciousness, then you could do what the aliens are doing. And this has had great military implications. So the Canadians knew, and this is important because this is 16 years before Betty and Barney Hill came forward and said that they were telepathically talking to aliens. This is almost 3 years before George Adamski and Williamson came forward to the first contactees. There was nobody talking to aliens telepathically. And the Canadians had already put it in a top secret memo that the Canadian government has not denied. We followed that, and we end up coming across this Dr. Eric Walker, former president of Penn State University, former chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, where DARPA comes from. It's the top military think tank to the U.S. military. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense, 14 honorary doctorate degrees, friends with Eisenhower, very good friends with Milton Eisenhower, the president's brother. Very, very powerful guy. During one of the interviews, he realizes what's going on, how the UFO cover-up took place, why it took place, what's behind it, all this sort of stuff. He kept telling us, leave it alone. There's nothing you can do about it. Go study something else. We kept pushing. He's doing an interview. He's being interviewed by a guy in Great Britain. They're talking about MJ-12. How many people are in MJ-12? Is there still 12? And he's not, I don't want to talk about this. Is it all Americans? Is it an international group? Who's running the show? And he stops and he says, look, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And the guy in Great Britain didn't have an answer. So Walker answers it. And he's talking about MJ-12, the control group. He said, look, unless you understand about ESP and how it works, you will not be taken in. Very few people understand how it works. That's 1991. 1993, Jan Hartson, who I've already talked about with his dramatic UFO experience, 9-10 years old in the backyard. He's at UCLA. He graduates from engineering at UCLA. He's there. Ben Rich, the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, all the Black Ops stuff, is there giving a lecture. 1993, just before he dies, he's giving this lecture. The last slide he shows is the famous flying saucers slide. He shows it. He says, we now have the technology to take ET home. We've discovered the mistake in the equation. All the audience laughs, except for Jan Hartson and Keller, who is another UFO researcher who's graduated from engineering at UCLA. They both say, this is significant. This guy, we've got to talk to this guy. He's just released something. So when the lecture's over, there was a couple of questions. Jan Hartson chases Ben Rich out of the room. Ben Rich is heading for his car. He says, Ben, what do you mean you've discovered the mistake in the equation? What are you talking about? We've got the technology to take ET home. I'm interested in UFO propulsion. I'm interested in UFOs. How do they get here? How does it work? And he said, Ben Rich turned around and said exactly what Walker had said to us 2 years before. He said, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And Jan Hartson didn't know what to do, so he said, well, that just means everything in time and space is connected. And Ben Rich said, that's how it works. Gets out, gets in his car, and drives away. So you have these three at the highest level of government saying, look at ESP. This is critically important. Mm-hmm. So I give this lecture last February. I give this lecture in Phoenix on the consciousness thing. After the lecture, the host that hosted me at Phoenix MUFON when I lectured just before that says, there's this woman that wants to talk to you. And I figured, well, I've agreed to talk to her. And she said, well, she's coming back on Monday. And I said, oh, okay. And I'm really petrified. I'm figuring like, oh, wow, I don't even know who this woman is or what the deal is or what I agreed to talk about or whatever. The woman comes to the door and she with her boyfriend. She's an older lady. And she says, "What did Stacy tell you about me?" And I said, "I don't know. I was supposed to talk to you." She said, "That's good." She comes walking in. She starts talking about my lecture, and then she starts talking about remote viewing. She's working for the American government. She's got all these connections. She's going on, and you hear this stuff from time to time. So I'm going, okay, whatever, She's talking, and all of a sudden she says, "And I've flown the flying saucers a few times." I said, "You what?" She said, "Yeah, I've flown quite a few models. I've flown the flying saucers." I said, "You've flown a flying saucer?" And she said, "Yeah, I've done it quite often." I said, "Well, how do you fly a flying saucer?" And she says, "Well, you do it with your mind." And I went, "You do?" And she says, "Yeah, it's all mental. That's how they fly the thing around." And I thought, wow, it's like I'm kind of dumb. The first time I ever heard that before, I thought this is really weird. Within 6 months, I had 18 people come to me, and mostly women, who said, "Oh, I've got these flying dreams. I have this dream I'm flying the flying saucer." And I always say the same thing. "Well, hang on. How do you fly a flying saucer? How is it happening in your dream or in your memory or whatever?" And they all say the same thing. "Well, you fly it with your mind." And I had 18 people, and mostly women. And so when Jacob says they're here to take over, they're going to, this is the end of the world or whatever, I say, if they're going to take over and eat us or whatever the hell they're going to do, why are they teaching women to fly the flying saucer? Why are they teaching people to fly the flying saucer? In Saudi Arabia, if you're a woman, you cannot drive a car. And yet, if you're a Saudi Arabian woman, it appears that they'll let you fly the flying saucer. So this is this whole connection. And so when I started to look at this symbiotic relationship between the human being and the craft, that's what they're after. This idea that you can use the mind to control the thing. And one of the stories that I chased was this story, and I always forget his name. He was a kid, 17 years old, had done this rocket.
David Adair.
David Adair. So David Adair's story, he had been very popular, and then he was one of Stephen Greer's witnesses in 1997. What happened was when he went to the hearing, Stephen Greer pulled him out the second day. Now, what David Adair says is that Stephen Greer was given a warning. This is his version of the story. Stephen Greer has never said why he pulled David Adair as a witness. David Adair said he got a warning that this guy is telling the truth, and he stepped over the line. You can't step over the line. You got to get this guy. He cannot make this testimony. So I sort of dropped it. When I heard that he had been dropped as a witness, I thought, and everybody said he's hoaxing. I thought, well, maybe he is hoaxing. I mean, why would Stephen Greer? He must know. I mean, he must have pulled him for a reason. Maybe he realized he wasn't telling the truth. So I had dropped it. Well, when this consciousness, this synchronicity, or this symbiotic relationships came, David Adair's story is basically that when he fired this rocket, that Curtis LeMay was involved. It landed at Area 51. They told him where to land it. They take him to Area 51, and his rocket is there and stuff. Then they take him underground, and they say, "What do you think of this?" And they show him this big, huge engine. And he looks at it, and he tells the story. He puts his hand on this engine, and all this, it starts to move. It starts to react. And he suddenly realizes this thing is alive. And he says that this is an engine, an alien spacecraft engine, and this thing's alive. So this is a story he tells, that he was going to tell for the Congress in 1997 about him seeing this object or this thing that was alive. So when I got this thing with this woman telling me this, and this whole thing about the alien being part of the craft, and that may have been what the whole cover-up was about, was if you have a live alien in 1947 that's using telepathy, and you realize there's really no engine in the craft, or there's no controls in the craft. They realize the alien is flying this thing with his mind. They would realize the significance of this stuff. So I start tracking David Adair's story, and I research, and he's off the radar. He doesn't talk to anybody anymore. But what I find out is he goes to the Parr Laboratory at Princeton University. So I start tracking this, and what's the Parr Laboratory doing? What kind of stuff are they doing? And I start doing consciousness. I start doing the Google searches with consciousness. Parr Laboratory consciousness. And there's a rumored story. This is just a story, on some website about them doing shielding for the F-22 Raptor jet fighter. That the Parr Laboratory had been called in by James McDonald, was providing a lot of the money for the Parr Laboratory. They had been called in to provide shielding for the F-22, because the F-22, according to this story, said that they were using the mind. Was part of the mind was being used to fly the F-22, and that they wanted shielding so that the mind wouldn't set off the munitions on the aircraft. So Parr Laboratory had been called. So this is the rumored story. So I search consciousness and F-22, and I pop up on this experiment. It was done in 2004 at the University of Southern southern Florida, I believe it was. That guy's name escapes me, but if you Google search rat brain and F-22, this video will pop up. And what it was it was the Paralaboratory was involved in this. What it was a guy who takes a rat brain. Now, we talk about evolution. We talk about consciousness. When you get enough neurons, then you get this consciousness. And we have the most consciousness because it's got the, 100 billion neurons or whatever it is. And so what this guy takes is not the 10 billion or 100 billion neurons. He takes 25,000 neurons from a rat brain. He takes them, he puts them in a little tiny petri dish about the size of a quarter. And on the bottom of the petri dish, this video will show you, it has these electrodes, metal electrodes that run into the petri dish. And what he does is he puts them in there, and then they watch it. And after about 3 days, this thing actually turns into a brain. It starts to signal. The neurons are talking to each other. And then they say, well, let's see what we can do with this thing. So what they do is they hitch up this little 25,000 neurons that are now communicating with each other. They hitch it up to a simulator for an F-22 Raptor. And on the video, you'll see them flying this thing. And what they do is when I can't remember if it's high or low, but if the plane is going down, what they do is they send a high-frequency signal to the neurons, and the neurons will respond back with a low-frequency signal and straighten the plane out. Then they go from side to side, and they go, and they manage to teach 25,000 neurons from a rat brain to fly an F-22 simulator, jet fighter. Mm-hmm. And I was in New Jersey talking about this, and I asked George Filer. He was a pilot for the U.S. Air Force. I said, George, do you think this would be easy to fly a simulator? And he said, no, it's not. So here's this little rat brain flying this thing. And then what they do is they actually change the weather. They put the worst winds, they put thunderstorms, they put everything, the worst weather conditions you can possibly, they set it into the computer. And this little rat brain continues to fly the F-22. And that's what it's all about. That's this neural, this whole symbiotic thing, this neural interlink where you can control the brain. That's when you get into the military, when you get in. And that experiment was done 2004. And if you look at that, the guys that were doing that, there really is nothing. It's almost like that went black. That research sort of disappeared. But if a public laboratory is doing that kind of research, you can bet that the U.S. military is doing that kind of research. The whole idea of being able to control flying, planes with their mind, because Bob Emenegger told me, Bob Emenegger is famous for doing the famous Holloman Air Force Base documentary in the 1970s. I believe it was set up by Richard Nixon. It was this documentary. They were brought into the CIA to Norton Air Force Base inside a CIA clean room. They were told that there had been a landing at Holloman Air Force Base. The aliens had been there. It had all been filmed from 3 different angles, and that they were going to be given this film. They wanted them to do a documentary to acclimatize the people. They do this documentary. They get all sorts of cooperation from everybody in the military. They put this documentary out in 1974, 1975, and it actually becomes when I talked to him, I said, the scenario that you're talking about sounds very much like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He said, oh, I didn't tell you. And I said, no, you didn't tell me what? He said, Steven Spielberg asked for a copy of our documentary. And I said, no, he didn't tell me that. And he said, well, I told you his sister Annie Spielberg worked with us, and she did UFO documentaries and sci-fi documentaries and films with us and stuff like that. And Steven Spielberg had asked for the documentary. So the Holloman Air Force Base story of this landing, this prearranged landing at 6 o'clock in the morning in May of 1971, becomes Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Steven Spielberg actually just changes the location, but the scenario is exactly the same. They're prepared, they're filming, and this UFO comes in, and they exchange, and they talk to the people on the ground, and this sort of stuff. And Steven Spielberg's mother said to Bob Emenegger after Close Encounters came out, she said, Bob, I've seen your version of the landing, and I've seen Steven's version of the landing, and I like Steven's version better. But the point of this is that Bob, when he was doing this documentary, was taken all over the place. He had complete openness. Anybody, he said, there's no cover-up. There's no UFO cover-up. Everybody talked. We could go to anybody. They would tell us everything. We had no roadblocks. But one of the things that he was shown, he was at DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where stealth came from, where over-the-horizon radar, all the big high-tech black budget stuff comes through DARPA. He's at DARPA. This is 1973. He's in there. They're going to different things. They're showing him dolphin research and, dogs and all sorts of stuff. He comes into the one room, and there's a guy sitting in a chair, and there's a big, huge computer. But back then, it was like half the room was the computer. The guy's just sitting in a chair, and the guy that's with Bob that's taking the tour says, okay, tell Bob what you're doing. He said, I can't. It's classified. I can't talk about it. He said, no, it's okay. Tell Bob what you're doing. He said, no, I can't. This is classified. This is civilian. I can't talk about it. He said, you've been given clearance. You can talk. What are you doing? And he said, well, I'm talking to the computer. And Bob said this guy was sitting in a chair just by himself, and that they had this computer up to 7 or 10 words. So the guy would think in his mind, chalkboard, and the computer would go, chalkboard. This is 1973 already, that they had this thing that Bob, and I totally believe Bob, this is true, that this guy was sitting in a room and he was using his mind to talk to a computer. So if that's what they had in 73, you can imagine what they're going through. And that's the important part, is when you start to realize this symbiotic thing with aircraft, the power of being able to get into somebody's mind, of being able to abduct people, be back in Washington for lunch, put ideas in people's heads. It's that kind of technology that they would spend any amount of money, kill anybody to keep the secret. This is what it's all about to me, is realizing this. And because the Canadians knew in November of 1950, because they had in this document that they had been told, not by people off the street, but by high-level American officials, that mental phenomena was involved in November of 1950, they had understood this whole thing right from the word go. They knew basically what was going on, and the whole idea that we're studying UFOs, we don't know what's going on, it was all a smokescreen. They knew basically from the word go what the key components were, and they've been pushing ever since to build that. And as your experience shows, they're probably highly advanced at developing this stuff. If they already knew about the mental phenomena back in 1950 and had started MK Ultra in Canada, hired a Canadian scientist. That was always the big thing. Why would you hire a Canadian scientist? Because the Canadians were highly involved in this. They had this connection to the mental phenomena. They had that connection, and that's why MK Ultra basically started at this laboratory in Canada, and the guy was doing ESP, he was doing psychic driving experiments and stuff like that, and the mind control went on from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's consciousness and motion, and we've had this discussion before. I mean, I can confirm point blank that there's synthetic telepathy. I've been interfaced with it. Obviously, you know that, and it's in my books. So, I mean, it is a real technology, and it is underground in black budget and covert technology areas. So, I mean, and who knows how far they can really go with it, but I have a feeling it can go extremely, extremely far. But we are naturally telepathic, and the symbiotic relationship between any object, I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you merge psychically with your connected, target, and then you're navigating with it. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and it would be important. You would see it, and you would say, like, I mean, people would say, well, why are they covering up? I mean, just take a look at it. I mean, you look at that, and you go, like, wow. Or do you want to give that to Al-Qaeda, China, North Korea, Russia? I mean, that kind of technology, it basically comes down to this thing about lead time weapons, which, I mean, back in the 50s they were talking about this. It's the whole idea of lead time is that if you think you're the good guys and you have this powerful technology, whoever has it basically rules the world. And if you want the good guys to have it, so that if you have to use it, then you have this thing about lead time. So that's why the Americans got so far ahead after World War II, is because they had the atomic bomb and nobody else had it. You can't just fight back an atomic bomb if you don't have an atomic bomb. So you go to the leader and say, well, they got this atomic bomb. Like, for example, the Japanese, they dropped the first atomic bomb, and you go to the emperor and say, Emperor, they dropped this atomic bomb, and he said, okay, we got to fight back. We got to build an atomic bomb. We'll use it against them. And say, how long is it going to take to build it? Well, about 6 years. And, well, it's over. The war is over in a couple of days. And now you have this technology that probably is going to take like 70 or 100 years to fully develop all the aspects of the technology, the flight characteristics, the telepathy, all this sort of stuff. I mean, if you have to use it, the other side is going to take 100 years to catch up. So you play the game, we're stupid, we don't know what's going on, we're not working on this, and what you want is the other side to believe that you're really not doing anything, and meanwhile, you're building this lead time. The farther you can get ahead, when you have to actually use it, the other side, it's game over. You just hand in your guns, and the war is over, because you can't fight back against it, because it takes so long to develop it. And that's what's called lead time, and it's the most critical element in military technology, is to get a lead time on your enemy so that they can't fight back if you have a secret weapon.
I totally agree with that. And one reason that I did come forward with my information, was that I didn't want to see the wrong people misusing technology such as what I was exposed to. So that was a big, huge thing for me to, stand up and be counted for. So it makes perfect sense of what you're talking about. I mean, it's incredible. I can't believe we've almost gone through 2 hours of this show, but we still have some time left. But it's awesome, Grant, talking to you about everything. I mean, my goodness, we could talk for hours and hours about everything. And I did have a question. I was trying to remember back. You talked briefly in your book on page 83, you talked about Dr. Walker and the conversation they had. There was an emphasis on mathematics in that conversation. I don't know if you remember that correctly or not, but what exactly was he referring to?
Do you have the quote? Because that's a critical thing. Because Ben Rich talked about the same sort of things.
Let's see here.
Unless you have the mind of Einstein, you can do nothing. Leave it alone.
That's it. Yeah, that was it.
Unless you have the mind of Einstein. He kept saying to us, when we first came up, what happened is the MJ-12 documents were released in Washington by Bill Moore, Stanton Friedman, Jamie Chandray. The thing went public within a couple of days. Bill Steinman had phoned Walker and basically said to him, we had learned that Walker had been at a series of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on crashed flying saucers. So Steinman phoned him up and he said, I've got information that you were at a briefing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base dealing with the recovery of a flying saucer and extraterrestrials. And Walker said, yeah, I was there, so what? And he went, what it is? He freaks out, like, this is the most important thing in the world, and you got a responsibility to tell people. And he said, look, leave it alone. There's nothing you can do about it. You're up against the windmills. Forget it. Go study something else. And he always had this impression was the fact that it was way beyond, unless you have the mind of Einstein, you're not going to do anything with this. So you're wasting your time. It's way too complex for you to try to figure out. And so he made this point. Now, the key thing was, when he brought up this mathematics thing, one of the things that happened was, I had this experience to talk to Dick Cheney, and I asked Dick Cheney, in all your jobs in government, have you ever been briefed on the subject of flying saucers? If so, when was it and what were you told? And Dick Cheney said, if I had been briefed on that subject, it would probably be classified and I wouldn't be talking about it. So I had the idea, as soon as that happened, I went, wow, this is what we've got to do, is we've got to catch these high-level officials off guard and ask them not, have you seen a UFO, not, are you interested in UFOs? The question you have to ask if you hit a president, a vice president, head of, the Defense Department or whatever, you got to say, have you ever been briefed? Because the briefing is the truth. The briefing is someone walks into your office, swears you to secrecy, and they brief you on the subject. They read you in, as I referred to Dick Cheney. They read you in. They tell you what's going on. This is what we discovered in U.S. intelligence. This is the end. So they'll give you the briefing. So I said, you've got to start asking people the briefing. And during the 2004 campaign, General Wesley Clark, who was a four-star general with a unified command inside the U.S. Army, and that was what I was told. If you're a four-star general with a unified command, you get the full UFO briefing, the ET briefing, or whatever it is. So Wesley Clark is campaigning in 2004, and Wesley Clark is in New Hampshire. And at that point, he's leading. He's actually leading the Democrats. And he makes this rant. He's asked by Jay Buckley, who was a space shuttle astronaut. He said, General, what's your vision on space? And he starts on this thing about going faster than the speed of light. He said, I believe we can go faster than the speed of light. I know people don't believe me. I've argued with physicists. I believe we can do it. And I'm thinking, wow, this guy's a four-star general. And then I get a message from one of these Avery guys. I get a message and says, a little bird told me that the general's been briefed on crash flying saucers. So now he's running around. It's the early part of the campaign. You know how the presidential campaign works. In the very early part of the campaign, they're in Iowa, they're in New Hampshire, and they're having town halls. They're actually talking to people. As soon as you get about 3 months into the campaign, they shut up. They've got their platform. They don't really answer any questions. They're just protecting it, because the more you say, the more mistakes you make, and the media and everybody jumps on it, and you get thrown out of the campaign. So they're asking questions. So I'm saying, basically, I'm asking MUFON state directors in the United States, I'm saying, Wesley Clark is four-star general. I've been told he's been briefed on crash flying saucers. He's made the statement we can go past the speed of light. Somebody has to ask him, have you been briefed? Nobody asks him till exactly 2 days before the end. He's campaigning for Kerry. Kerry's won the nomination. He's up against Bush. He's campaigning in Reno, Nevada. A friend of mine, Dr. David Rudiak, is there. Rudiak had one chance to ask him before and said, no, I don't want to embarrass him. To which I said, if we're not going to ask the question, I mean, why would you expect the media or somebody else? I mean, this is our job, to ask the question. I mean, we can't expect to be embarrassed and then think that somebody else should, disclose the truth to you. We're the ones that have to disclose it. So he decided, okay, he's here. I'm going to watch his speech and I'll ask him the briefing question. At the end of the thing, he says to General Clark, he says, General Clark, when you were campaigning in New Hampshire, you said that you believed we could go past the speed of light, and you were very adamant about it. I'd like to ask you, General, have you ever been briefed on the subject of flying saucers? And he said, he was just shocked. He just sort of looked down at the floor. He didn't know what to say. And he looked up and he said, I know some stuff. In fact, I'm going to Roswell tonight. And he was going in. New Mexico is always a swing state. Everybody goes there the last minute. They try to get those 5 electoral votes at the end of the campaign. And he was going to Roswell the very next day. And so Rudak didn't fall for it. So he says, so you were briefed. And it was at that point that Clark says, well, we have some problems. We have to work out the mathematics. So the second time, Walker had mentioned it, and now suddenly Wesley Clark had mentioned it, and then you have Ben Rich in 1993 mentions it again. Ben Rich says, we've discovered the mistake in the equation. We now have the technology to take ET home. So here you have this thing that mathematics appears to be a key part of the whole thing. There's something about mathematics, and Ben Rich is basically saying in 1993, Lockheed Skunk Works had discovered the mistake in the equation, and they now knew how it worked.
That's really incredible. Well, you can kind of understand why they're kind of not communicating what's really happening behind the scenes, but at the same time, it's very frustrating for everybody on the planet now. Insofar as, the Fukushima situation doesn't look real good, and I'm wondering why we haven't had any UFOs, or maybe we have, I don't know offhand. I don't know if you've heard anything insofar as any UFOs connected in with that at all?
Well, there was, but of course you know what happens with the sightings. There was a video released of a UFO over top of the Fukushima plant. The problem there would be that it's totally evacuated. So there's nobody around there to take pictures. I mean, you got 50 miles or whatever. You can't get within 50 miles of this place. So anybody who's in there, unless they're a UFO buff, wouldn't. I did have one of the things I did study, which is kind of interesting. I very interested in contactees, and I wrote a paper called The Alien Crystal Ball, and it's on my website at presidentialufo.com. But the Alien Crystal Ball, I talk about all these people who get these downloads, and Chris Bledsoe was one of them. He had the download when he gave this famous speech at Asheville, North Carolina, when this religion professor picks up on it and decides they want to do a movie on this. During that, he gets some sort of harassment from somebody in the audience, and in the back of his head, he gets this voice that says, tell him there's going to be an earthquake in Baja, California on September the 25th. So Chris goes, there's going to be an earthquake in Baja on September 25th. And the voice in the back of his head says, tell him there's going to be a natural disaster that's going to affect the end of the 2012 presidential election. So he says, there's going to be a huge natural disaster that's going to affect the end of the 2012 presidential election. And then it turns out there was 3 earthquakes in Baja, California, September 25th, and at the end of the presidential 2012 campaign, Hurricane Sandy came down the coast, knocked out all the polls. They had to reset the polls, and there was these predictions came true. And so I've watched all these different people, contactees, who've had these, and one of them was this girl who I mentioned who had this sighting when she was 7 years old near where I live here, right near the U.S. border, maybe only about 10 miles from the U.S. border, where she sees this flying saucer, and then she starts having these dreams her whole life. She has this sort of a rapture dream. She gets these feelings where she gets these dreams, and one of the things, the dream she had was the Fukushima disaster, that she saw this. And she said when she gets the dream, when she gets the vision of what's going to happen, and she mentioned that when she mentioned a big train crash that I tracked down in China, a disaster in a mine in Utah where the people were actually alive, and some people were died, tried to rescue them, and they stopped the rescue, and these people ended up dying. But the Fukushima she saw, and she said when she has the vision, when she gets this vision of this happening, she can not only see it, she can taste the blood, she can smell it. She said it's absolutely horrible when she has this, and it was one of the things that she saw before Fukushima. So she's sort of in touch with me now because she now lives in Florida, but she keeps in touch with me now, and I say, anytime, and she has had the feeling. She said she starts getting the feeling, she gets this sort of unease, a headache that she can't get rid of with pills, stuff like that, and she started on June on December 6th. So she said something is happening, something's about to happen. So there's a number of these people who get these sort of these visions of these sort of disasters that sort of shows the idea that time, space, and gravity don't exist, which fits into the whole consciousness thing. That, you know, when you get down to it, you know, physical world is largely an illusion, that, you know, that it's all space, and you start looking into quantum physics, and you see the world completely differently, and you get these people who are basically sort of slipping around in this sort of however the world works, and they're seeing these little glimpses of the future, and they think maybe it's the aliens giving it to them. But you get other people, which is something I bring up in my lecture.
And Grant, I'm going to have to cut you off real quick. We've got 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure everybody knows where they can purchase your books and your website and how they can get a hold of you.
The website is presidentialufo.com. The book is available from Amazon.com, and I'm giving a series of lectures starting January the 18th in Phoenix, Arizona, for Phoenix MUFON. I'm giving a little talk for MUFON in Tucson, MUFON in Salt Lake City, the Exopolitics in Boulder on February the 28th, and that's about it. So I'm moving around. I'm actually leaving for the Southwest in a couple of days. And
your book is UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informants, right?
Correct.
Okay. All right. And we've got maybe just a few minutes here, but I just want to thank you again for being on the show tonight. It's been so wonderful to have you on. It's been good to reconnect with you again, and I hope to have you on very soon.
Well, I appreciate your interest, and we're working on the same sort of stuff, so I watch your stuff very carefully, and I think you have a lot to add, so I hope you can sort of look at this this alien band thing and see if there's some connection that you can sort of tie into the government. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I actually need to talk to you off air sometime. We'll discuss that because I have a lot of good information to provide you with.
Beautiful.
So yeah, definitely. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. It's well appreciated. And I want to thank my producer who did a fantastic job, Keith. And I guess we're almost ready to roll out of here, but stay tuned for next week when my special guest will be Gordon James Gianni Noto. Yeah, everybody have a fabulous week, and I will see you next week.